And we're back for part two. And so I've just called this the papers in between 27 and 28. So what we get is two documents and a section of the Doctrine and Covenants as we have it today. So we get section 29. So 28 and 29 are sort of flipped in their order. Section 29 is actually a little bit more of a lengthy revelation, and that will receive its own episode next week. But for now, what I'd like to talk about is the two documents that we do have. The first one is a deed from Isaac Hale and Elizabeth Hale dated on the 25th of August, 1830. And this is when Joseph Smith buys a house. This document is housed in the Church History Library. And so it's owned by the church. And the gist of it is, with all this legal jargon, this was a form, as you can see, that was filled out, by witnesses and, both parties and all this for the sale of a property. But in essence, what this is Joseph was able to make his final payment on a house that cost $200. What did he get for $200 in 1830 in upstate New York? Well, I'll tell you. And this, cost of real estate, I'm not taking this personally, but I'm just saying you got a whole lot for $200 back then. So he got 13 and a half acres, portion of land off of the Hale property. So this is Emma Hale's family, and Emma Smith's family, if you will, Emma Hale Smith. He got 13.5 acres of land. Including on that acreage was, quote, a frame home, a barn, and other improvements. So the historical introduction to this document, and this is coming from Documents Volume 1 in the Joseph Smith paper series, says the agreement required Joseph Smith to pay $114 by the 1st of May, 1829, and the balance of $86 by the 1st of May, 1830. Joseph Smith paid the first installment, but when he missed the second, Hale allowed him to pay interest on the payment and extended the due date, rather than rescinding the contract. By the 26th of August, 1830, the property was transferred to Joseph Smith. So, I don't know. I spent a little bit more than $200 on my house, and I don't have 13 and a half acres. And even by today's standards, I think, just real estate was a lot more affordable back then than it is now. Of course, there was a different connotation behind it. So what's the aftermath of this? So they made the sale happen. And I get this from, the historical introduction again. It says, within a few days of concluding this transaction, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith departed Harmony, never to reside there again. They moved to Peter Whitmer Sr.'s home in Fayette, New York, staying there until they moved to Ohio in January 1831. In June of 1833, Joseph Smith and Emma sold the Harmony property for $300 to Joseph McCune Jr., the neighbor on the east side of the property. So it was theirs for all of 3 years, and they never really lived in it, which maybe it wasn't that big of a deal then, but that seems hard to me. The deed describes the property and the proper parties signed. It's witnessed according to New York state law. And so you get a lot of this like, oh, the property goes to this line and it goes over here and there's a tree over there and there's an outhouse here and all this kind of stuff. And they describe it. So I'm not going to get into all that detail with you. But if you flip the document over, the back side of the document confirmed that all was in order. Elizabeth Hale was very connected to the property. She understood what she was getting into because it was apparently her dowry interest. Now, if you recall, we've talked about this before. So when Martin Harris and Lucy Harris had a bit of their falling out, even before the Book of Mormon was a thing, when they were married, part of Lucy Harris's dowry was land that Martin Harris had. It was part of his wealth. And so as sort of a post-nuptial agreement in what we would call it today, she basically said, I want my dowry interest back because I don't want you to sell it for the printing of the Book of Mormon, which again, I think was probably maybe a smart move because he probably would have done that. But anyway, the same kind of concept is here with the Hale family, is that Emma Smith's mother, Elizabeth, basically said, I can see, I'm sober, I'm of my right mind, I'm signing this over, and sold it to her daughter. and her husband. So I thought that was kind of an interesting connection there of a dower interest. And there was a couple of, filing fees, dollar and something. Anyway, it's just not as much as it is now, let's just say. But anyway, all the fees were paid by Joseph Smith, and it was a fully executed deal. So that was their home. And this is a picture of their home we still have. There was a 2-story addition that was added later on, as you can see. But that was the frame house described, and 13.5 acres on top of that for farming. And yeah, they actually owned it for 3 years, and usually that means it was maybe, given out to others to, make a profit thereby, but not them. They had to move right away. And I would imagine that was sad. So anyway, enough about homes and real estate. We're going to move on to a letter that was sent to Newell Knight and to the church in Colesville. So we sort of touched on this in the previous part, but a bunch of people got baptized, and then they couldn't do any confirmations because Joseph was arrested and there was a mob and everybody was being a jerk and all this kind of stuff. So they couldn't finish. But what we get here is 9 pages, very small pages with larger handwriting on it, of a letter that was sent to these people that were in Colesville, New York, in 28th of August, 1830. It's from the original letter is gone, but what we get is this history called Newell Knight's history. And according to the source note, it said it was written in an unknown hand, which I thought was strange. Like, wouldn't it be in Newell Knight's hand? But here's what you get. From the source note, the handwriting of an unknown scribe, possibly Samuel Knight, who's the son of Newell and Sarah Coburn Knight, Samuel's wife, Carolina, or James McClellan, husband of Lydia Goldthwaite Knight McClellan. So that's the handwriting question. So the history of this document I thought was interesting. So you don't usually get entertained by a source note because it's like, oh, it's in Revelation book 1 and we've already talked about it. In this case, I just want to quote from this. It's a little lengthy, but I just thought it was really interesting. So from the source note of the Joseph Smith Papers, this is Documents Volume 1, it says, at the time this manuscript was created, McClellan, who had been married to Newell Knight from 1835 until his death in 1847, possessed documents of her late husband that are no longer extant, including letters, licenses, and certificates. It appears that those working under her direction created this manuscript by copying with some modifications from an earlier draft of Newell Knight's history, and by incorporating therein copies of these various documents. In the earlier Newell Knight history, from which this circa 1871 work was copied, Knight himself apparently used Joseph Smith's history, published serially in the Times and Seasons, as a framework for his narrative, at times copying this text verbatim. There are at least 3 similar contextually related versions of Newell Knight's history housed in the Church History Library. This circa 1871 version appears to be the basis for a condensed version published in 1883. Lydia Goldthwaite Knight McClellan appears to have taken a history of Newell Knight, possibly this circa 1871 manuscript, to the church historian's office. The historian's office journal mentions a history of Newell Knight in its 9 April 1872 entry and states that, and this is, I love this part, that in, quote, tin box containing history of Newell Knight was returned to Sister Knight. The circa 1871 manuscript was later found in a tin box in the basement of a house once owned by Knight's granddaughter in Provo, Utah. It was given to a descendant of Newell Knight. So to all you hoarders out there, some random tin box in the basement of a house in Provo, Utah, housed this document and a bunch of other things from Newell Knight, who experienced the first miracle of the church. I just thought that was just mind-blowing. It's fun. Again, this is a very long time ago that they found this tin box, but thank heavens for tin boxes, I guess, back in the day. And since then, I think it's been cared for a little bit better than being in somebody's basement. But footnote 1 from the source note on this as well says, in February of 1873, Lydia Goldthwaite Knight McClellan, boy, we love saying her whole name, don't we? Anyway, authored a preface to Knight's history and explained that the creation of this history was his, quote, dying request. She stated to her readers that she had done the best I could in compiling the work, although considerable portions of Knight's journal were kept on detached pieces of paper, and no doubt many interesting and valuable portions are lost. So for all you journal writers out there, keep your journals safe. Don't just do them on loose pieces of paper because you might lose a few. But anyway, so this book that we're reading from now apparently was Newell Knight's dying wish. I thought that was very touching. Okay, so the historical introduction to this letter we get from Documents Volume 1 says, in August, Colesville church members Newell and Sally Knight visited Joseph Smith in Harmony, Pennsylvania. During the night's stay, plans were made for Joseph Smith to meet with the church members in Colesville on a specified day in late August. The Knights returned to Colesville, and arrangements were made for the brethren and sisters to meet on that day, if possible, without letting our enemies know anything about it. However, the men who were to transport Joseph Smith to Colesville did not arrive in time for him to attend the meeting, and Joseph Smith and John Whitmer wrote this letter to explain their absence. And so the aftermath of this letter, so again, letters written, I'll get into the content of it in a second, but what happens after it's given? From the historical introduction, it says, likely on the 4th of September, the day he promised in the letter that he would arrive, Joseph Smith arrived in Colesville along with Hiram Smith, David Whitmer, and John Whitmer. Joseph Smith history recounts, we that evening assembled the church and confirmed them, partook of the sacrament, and held a happy meeting, having much reason to rejoice in the God of our salvation, and sing hosannas to his holy name. The animosity toward members of the Church of Christ in Colesville did not dissipate, however, and Knight recalled, quote, it was not long after the brethren had left us when the mob began to gather, and threaten and abuse us in a most shameful and disgusting manner during the remainder of the day. So they did wind up getting together, but their sort of peaceful gathering was short-lived. So what's in this thing? Well, to put it briefly, there's apologies for not attending in person, explanation of why, the delay is actually not given, which I thought was interesting. I mean, he was arrested and had court appearances, but he never actually says why he was late to the meeting or why he didn't show up. He did acknowledge a lot of the issues that the saints were having, that they were being persecuted, that they had some issues, and in fact, they were sort of to meet maybe even secretly so that their enemies wouldn't molest them. So we get something from footnote 12, which I thought was interesting. Of this plan to keep the forthcoming meeting secret, Joseph Smith history records, quote, we had called upon our Heavenly Father in mighty prayer that he would grant us an opportunity of meeting with them, that he would blind the eyes of our enemies so that they would not know us, and that we might on this occasion return unmolested. Our prayers were not in vain, for when within a little distance of Mr. Knight's, Joseph Knight Sr.'s place, we encountered a large company at work upon the public road, among whom were several of our most bitter enemies. They looked earnestly at us, but not knowing us, they passed on without interruption. So they were able to pass in peace, and that's how they made it to the meeting. So probably, if you want to call it, maybe a little bit of a miracle there, as described in this record. There's some other things about promises of their deliverance that's forthcoming, that the prophet's words, and this is talking about like ancient prophets, Old Testament, ancient time prophets, would be fulfilled. Prophecies about a lot of perilous times, things coming in the future. And there's even a postscript. And it says this, quote, P.S. Waited until Saturday morning, and our friends have not yet arrived. Please send Polly's letter and also the priest's with William, and oblige. So what does that mean? Footnote to this postscript says, William is perhaps William Stringham, one of the Colesville converts and Newell Knight's brother-in-law. Joseph and Polly Peck Knight's 19-year-old daughter, Polly, had become the target of a local priest's tirade against the Church of Christ. According to Newell Knight's recollection, the priest, quote, had chosen my sister Polly as a mark for his abuse. But in an exchange of letters with Polly, quote, the priest was so decidedly used up that he was glad to give it up and back out completely whipped. So that's according to that. So apparently there was a bit of a priest targeted this 19-year-old young woman, as for some reason his ire against the church, who knows what. Anyway, so those are the two papers that we have. The next thing that we have is Section 29. We'll get to that in another episode next week. It's a lengthy thing on its own, but just some kind of details about the history leading up to our next section, which is Part 3 and Section 28. So stay tuned for that.